Master Humphrey's Clock, Section 5. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Philippone. Master Humphrey's Clock, by Charles Dickens, Section 5. Chapter 3, Part 2. Second chapter of Mr. Pickwick's Tale. We left Will Marks leaning under the gibbet with his face towards the town, scanning the distance with a keen eye which sought to pierce the darkness and catch the earliest glimpse of any person or persons that might approach towards him. But all was quiet, and save the howling of the wind as it swept across the heath in gusts, and the creaking of the chains that dangled above his head, there was no sound to break the sullen stillness of the night. After half an hour or so, this monotony became more disconcerting to Will than the most furious uproar would have been, and he heartily wished for some one antagonist with whom he might have a fair stand-up fight, if it were only to warm himself. Truth to tell, it was a bitter wind, and seemed to blow to the very heart of a man whose blood, heated but now with rapid riding, was the more sensitive to the chilling blasts. Will was a daring fellow, and cared not a jot for hard knocks or sharp blades, but he could not persuade himself to move or walk about, having just that vague expectation of a sudden assault which made it a comfortable thing to have something at his back, even though that something were a gallows tree. He had no great faith in the superstitions of the age, still such of them as occurred to him did not serve to lighten the time, or to render his situation the more endurable. He remembered how witches were said to repair at that ghostly hour to churchyards and gibbets, and such like dismal spots, to pluck the bleeding mandrake or scrape the flesh from dead men's bones, as choice ingredients for their spells. How, stealing by night to lonely places, they dug graves with their finger nails, or anointed themselves before riding in the air with a delicate pomatum made of the fat of infants newly boiled. These and many other fabled practices of a no less agreeable nature, and all having some reference to the circumstances in which he was placed, passed and repassed in quick succession through the mind of Will Marks, and adding a shadowy dread to that distrust and watchfulness which his situation inspired, rendered it upon the whole sufficiently uncomfortable. As he had foreseen, too, the rain began to descend heavily, and driving before the wind in a thick mist obscured even those few objects which the darkness of the night had before imperfectly revealed. 'Look!' shrieked a voice. 'Great Heaven, it has fallen down, and stands erect as if it lived!' The speaker was close behind him. The voice was almost at his ear. Will threw off his cloak, drew his sword, and darting swiftly round, seized a woman by the wrist, who, recoiling from him with a dreadful shriek, fell struggling upon her knees. Another woman, clad like her whom he had grasped, in mourning garments, stood rooted to the spot on which they were, gazing upon his face with wild and glaring eyes that quite appalled him. 'Say,' cried Will, when they had confronted each other thus for some time, 'what are ye?' 'Say, what are you,' returned the woman, 'who trouble even this obscene resting place of the dead, and strip the gibbet of its honoured burden? Where is the body?' He looked in wonder and affright from the woman who questioned him to the other whose arm he clutched. 'Where is the body?' repeated the questioner more firmly than before. 'You wear no livery which marks you for the hireling of the government. You are no friend to us, or I should recognise you, for the friends of such as we are few in number. What are you then, and wherefore are you here?' 'I am no foe to the distressed and helpless,' said Will. 'Are ye among that number? Ye should be, by your looks.' 'We are,' was the answer. 'Is it ye who have been wailing and weeping here under cover of the night?' said Will. 'It is,' replied the woman sternly, and pointing as she spoke towards her companion. 'She mourns a husband, and I a brother. Even the bloody law that wreaks its vengeance on the dead does not make that a crime, and if it did, 'twould be alike to us who are past its fear or favour.' Will glanced at the two females, and could barely discern that the one whom he addressed was much the elder, and that the other was young and of a slight figure. Both were deadly pale, their garments wet and worn, their hair dishevelled and streaming in the wind, themselves bowed down with grief and misery, their whole appearance most dejected, wretched, and forlorn. A sight so different from any he had expected to encounter touched him to the quick, and all idea of anything but their pitiable condition vanished before it. 'I am a rough, blunt yeoman,' said Will. Why I come here is told in a word. You have been overheard at a distance in the silence of the night, and I have taken a watch for hags and spirits. I came here expecting an adventure and prepared to go through with any. If there be aught that I can do to help or aid you, name it, and on the faith of a man who can be secret and trusty, I will stand by you to the death.' 'How comes this gibbet to be empty?' asked the elder female. 'I swear to you,' replied Will, 'that I know as little as yourself. But this I know, that when I came here an hour ago or so, it was as it is now; and if, as I gathered from your question, it was not so last night, sure I am that it has been secretly disturbed without the knowledge of the folks in yonder town. Bethink you, therefore, whether you have no friends in league with you, or with him on whom the law has done its worst, by whom these sad remains have been removed for burial.' The women spoke together, and Will retired a pace or two while they conversed apart. He could hear them sob and moan, and saw that they wrung their hands in fruitless agony. He could make out little that they said, but between whiles he gathered enough to assure him that his suggestion was not very wide of the mark, and that they not only suspected by whom the body had been removed, but also whither it had been conveyed. When they had been in conversation a long time, they turned towards him once more. This time the younger female spoke. 'You have offered us your help?' 'I have.' 'And given a pledge that you are still willing to redeem?' 'Yes, so far as I may, keeping all plots and conspiracies at arm's length.' 'Follow us, friend.' Will, whose self possession was now restored, needed no second bidding, but with his drawn sword in his hand, and his cloak so muffled over his left arm as to serve for a kind of shield without offering any impediment to its free action, suffered them to lead the way. Through mud and mire, and wind and rain, they walked in silence a full mile. At length they turned into a dark lane, where suddenly starting out from beneath some trees where he had taken shelter, a man appeared, having in his charge 3 saddled horses. One of these, his own apparently, in obedience to a whisper from the women, he consigned to Will, who, seeing that they mounted also. Then, without a word spoken, they rode on together, leaving the attendant behind. They made no halt, nor slackened their pace until they arrived near Putney. At a large wooden house which stood apart from any other they alighted, and giving their horses to one who was already waiting, passed in by a side door, and so up some narrow creaking stairs into a small panelled chamber, where Will was left alone. He had not been here very long when the door was softly opened, and there entered to him a cavalier, whose face was concealed beneath a black mask. Will stood upon his guard and scrutinized this figure from head to foot. The form was that of a man pretty far advanced in life, but of a firm and stately carriage. His dress was of a rich and costly kind, but so soiled and disordered that it was scarcely to be recognized for one of those gorgeous suits which the expensive taste and fashion of the time prescribed from men of any rank or station. He was booted and spurred, and bore about him even as many tokens of the state of the roads as Will himself. All this he noted, while the eyes behind the mask regarded him with equal attention. This survey over, the cavalier broke silence. 'Thou'rt young and bold, and would be richer than thou art?' 'The 2 first I am,' returned Will. 'The last I have scarcely thought of. But be it so. Say that I would be richer than I am. What then?' 'The way lies before thee now,' replied the mask. 'Show it me.' 'First, let me inform thee that thou wert brought here to night lest thou shouldst too soon have told thy tale to those who placed thee in the watch.' 'I thought as much when I followed,' said Will, 'but I am no blab, not I.' 'Good,' returned the mask. 'Now listen. He who was to have executed the enterprise of burying the body, which, as thou suspected, was taken down to night, has left us in our need.' Will nodded, and thought within himself that if the mask were to attempt to play any tricks, the first eyelet hole on the left side of the doublet, counting from the buttons up the front, would be a very good place in which to pink him neatly. 'Thou art here, and the emergency is desperate. I propose his task to thee. Convey the body, now coffined in this house, by means that I shall show, to the church of St Dunstan in London to morrow night, and thy service shall be richly paid. Thou'rt about to ask whose corpse it is. Seek not to know. I warn thee, seek not to know. Felons hang in chains on every moor and heath. Believe, as others do, that this was one, and ask no further. The murders of state policy, its victims or avengers, had best remain unknown to such as thee.' 'The mystery of this service,' said Will, 'bespeaks its danger. What is the reward?' 100 golden unities,' replied the cavalier. 'The danger to one who cannot be recognised as the friend of a fallen cause is not great, but there is some hazard to be run. Decide between that and the reward.' 'What if I refuse?' said Will. 'Depart in peace, in God's name,' returned the Mask in a melancholy tone, 'and keep our secret, remembering that those who brought thee here were crushed and stricken women, and that those who bade thee go free could have had thy life with one word, and no man the wiser.' Men were readier to undertake desperate adventures in those times than they are now. In this case the temptation was great, and the punishment, even in case of detection, was not likely to be very severe, as Will came of a loyal stock and his uncle was in good repute, and a passable tale to account for his possession of the body and his ignorance of the identity might be easily devised. The cavalier explained that a coveted cart had been prepared for the purpose; that the time of departure could be arranged so that he should reach London Bridge at dusk, and proceed through the city after the day had closed in; that people would be ready at his journey's end to place the coffin in a vault without a minute's delay; that officious inquiries into the streets would be easily repelled by the tale that he was carrying for interment the corpse of one who had died of the plague; and, in short, showed him every reason why he should succeed, and none why he should fail. After a time they were joined by another gentleman, masked like the first, who added new arguments to those which had been already urged. The wretched wife, too, added her tears and prayers to their calmer representations, and in the end, Will, moved by compassion and good nature, by a love of the marvellous, by a mischievous anticipation of the terrors of the Kingston people when he should be missing next day, and finally by the prospect of gain, took upon himself the task, and devoted all his energies to its successful execution. The following night, when it was quite dark, the hollow echoes of old London Bridge responded to the rumbling of the cart which contained the ghastly load, the object of Will Marks' care. Sufficiently disguised to attract no attention by his garb, Will walked at the horse's head, as unconcerned as a man could be who was sensible that he had now arrived at the most dangerous part of his undertaking, but full of boldness and confidence. It was now 8 o'clock. After 9, none could walk the streets without danger of their lives, and even at this hour robberies and murder were of no uncommon occurrence. The shops upon the bridge were all closed; the lone wooden arches thrown across the way were like so many black pits, in every one of which ill favoured fellows lurked in knots of 3 or 4, some standing upright against the wall, lying in wait; others skulking in gateways, and thrusting out their uncombed heads and scowling eyes; others crossing and recrossing, and constantly jostling both horse and man to provoke a quarrel; others stealing away and summoning their companions in a low whistle. Once, even in that short passage, there was the noise of scuffling and the clash of swords behind him, but Will, who knew the city and its ways, kept straight on, and scarcely turned his head. The streets being unpaved, the rain of the night before had converted them into a perfect quagmire, which the splashing waterspouts from the gables, and the filth and offal cast from the different houses, swelled in no small degree. These odious matters, being left to putrefy the close and heavy air, emitted an insupportable stench, to which every court and passage poured forth a contribution of its own. Many parts, even of the main streets with their projecting stories tottering overhead, and nearly shutting out the sky, were more like huge chimneys than open ways. At the corners of some of these, great bonfires were burning to prevent infection from the plague, of which it was rumoured that some citizens had lately died; and few who, availing themselves of the light thus afforded, paused for a moment to look around them, would have been disposed to doubt the existence of the disease, or wonder at its dreadful visitations. But it was not in such scenes as these, or even in the deep and miry road, that Will Marks found the chief obstacles to his progress. There were kites and ravens feeding in the streets, the only scavengers the city kept, who, scenting what he carried, followed the cart or fluttered on its top, and croaked their knowledge of its burden and their ravenous appetite for prey. There were distant fires where the poor wood and plaster tenements wasted fiercely, and whither crowds made their way, clamouring eagerly for plunder, beating down all who came within their reach, and yelling like devils let loose. There were single-handed men flying from bands of ruffians, who pursued them with naked weapons, and hunted them savagely. There were drunken, desperate robbers, issuing from their dens and staggering through the open streets where no man dared molest them. There were vagabond servitors returned from the beer garden, which had been good sport that day, dragging after them their torn and bleeding dogs, or leaving them to die and rot upon the road. Nothing was abroad but cruelty, violence, and disorder. Many were the interruptions which Will Marks encountered from these stragglers, and many the narrow escapes he made. Now some stout bully would take his seat upon the cart, insisting to be driven to his own home, and now two or three men would come down upon him together and demand that on peril of his life he showed them what he had inside. Then a party of the city watch upon their rounds would draw across the road, and not satisfied with his tale question him closely, and revenge themselves by a little cuffing and hustling for maltreatment sustained at other hands that night. All these assailants had to be rebutted, some by fair words, some by foul, and some by blows, but Will Mark was not the man to be stopped or turned back now he had penetrated so far, and though he got on slowly, still he made his way down Fleet Street, and reached the church at last. As he had been forewarned, all was in readiness. Directly he stopped, the coffin was removed by four men, who appeared so suddenly that they seemed to have started from the earth. A fifth mounted the cart, and scarcely allowing Will time to snatch from it a little bundle containing such of his own clothes as he had thrown off on assuming his disguise, drove briskly away. Will never saw cart or man again. He followed the body into the church, and it was well he lost no time in doing so, for the door was immediately closed. There was no light in the building save that which had come from a couple of torches borne by two men in cloaks, which stood upon the brink of a vault. Each supported a female figure, and all observed a profound silence. By this dim and solemn glare, which made Will feel as though light itself were dead, and its tomb the dreary arches that frowned above, they placed the coffin in the vault with uncovered heads, and closed it up. One of the torch bearers then turned to Will, and stretched forth his hand, in which was a purse of gold. Something told him directly that those were the same eyes which he had seen beneath the mask. 'Take it,' said the cavalier in a low voice, 'and be happy. Though these have been hasty obsequies, and no priest had blessed the work, there will not be the least peace with thee thereafter for having laid his bones beside those of his little children. Keep thy own counsel, for thy sake no less than ours, and God be with thee.' 'The blessing of a widowed mother on thy head, good friend!' cried the younger lady through her tears. 'The blessing of one who has now no hope or rest but in this grave!' Will stood with the purse in his hand, and involuntarily made a gesture as though he would return it, for though a thoughtless fellow, he was of a frank and generous nature. But the two gentlemen, extinguishing their torches, cautioned him to be gone, as their common safety would be endangered by a longer delay, and at the same time their retreating footsteps sounded through the church. He turned, therefore, towards the point at which he had entered, and seeing, by a faint gleam in the distance, that the door was again partially open, groped his way towards it, and so passed into the street. Meantime, the local authorities of Kingston had kept watch and ward all the previous night, fancying every now and then that dismal shrieks were borne to them on the wind, and frequently winking to each other, and drawing closer to the fire as they drank the health of the lonely sentinel, upon whom a clerical gentleman present was especially severe by reason of his levity and youthful folly. Two or three of the gravest in company, who were of a theological turn, propounded to him the question whether such a character was not but poorly armed for single combat with the devil, and whether he himself would not have been a stronger opponent; but the clerical gentleman, sharply reproving them for their presumption in discussing such questions, clearly showed that a fitter companion than Will could scarcely have been selected, not only for that being a child of Satan he was the less likely to be alarmed by the appearance of his own father, but because Satan himself would be at his ease in such company, and would not scruple to kick up his heels to an extent which it was quite certain he would never venture before clerical eyes, under whose influence, as was notorious, he became quite a tame and milk and water character. But when next morning arrived, and with it no Will Marks, and when a strong party, repairing to the spot as a strong party ventured to do in broad day, found Will gone and the gibbet empty, matters grew serious indeed. The day passing away and no news arriving, and the night going on also without any intelligence, the thing grew more tremendous still. In short, the neighbourhood worked itself up to such a comfortable pitch of mystery and horror, that it is a great question whether the general feeling was not one of excessive disappointment, when, on the second morning, Will Marks returned. However this may be, back Will came in a very cool and collected state, and appearing not to trouble himself much about anybody except old John Podgers, who, having been sent for, was sitting in the town hall crying slowly, and dozing between whiles. Having embraced his uncle and assured him of his safety, Will mounted on a table and told his story to the crowd. And surely they would have been the most unreasonable crowd that ever assembled together, if they had been in the least respect disappointed with the tale he told them. For besides describing the witches' dance to the minutest motion of their legs, and performing it in character on the table, with the assistance of a broomstick, he related how they had carried off the body in a copper cauldron, and so bewitched him that he lost his senses until he found himself lying under a hedge at least 10 miles off, whence he had straightway returned, as they then beheld. The story gained such universal applause, that it soon afterwards brought down express from London the great witch finder of the age, the heaven born Hopkins, who, having examined Will closely on several points, pronounced it the most extraordinary and the best accredited witch story ever known, under which title it was published at the Three Bibles on London Bridge, in small quarto, with a view of the cauldron from an original drawing and a portrait of the clerical gentleman as he sat by the fire. On one point Will was particularly careful, and that was to describe for the witches he had seen, 3 impossible old females, whose likenesses never were or never will be. Thus he saved the lives of the suspected parties, and of all other old women who were dragged before him to be identified. This circumstance occasioned John Podgers much grief and sorrow, until happening one day to cast his eyes upon his housekeeper, and observing her to be plainly afflicted with rheumatism, he procured her to be burnt as an undoubted witch. For this service to the state he was immediately knighted, and became from that time Sir John Podgers. Will Marks never gained any clue to the mystery in which he had been an actor, nor did any inscription in the church which he often visited afterwards, nor any of the limited inquiries that he dared to make, yield him the least assistance. As he kept his own secret, he was compelled to spend the gold discreetly and sparingly. In the course of time he married the young lady of whom I have already told you, whose maiden name is not recorded, with whom he led a prosperous and happy life. Years and years after this adventure, it was his wont to tell her, upon a stormy night, that it was a great comfort to him to think those bones, to whomsoever they might have once belonged, were not bleaching in the troubled air, but were mouldering away with the dust of their own kith and kindred in a quiet grave. Further particulars of Master Humphrey's visitor. Being very full of Mr. Pickwick's application, and highly pleased with the compliment he had paid me, it will be readily supposed that long before our next night of meeting I communicated it to my 3 friends, who unanimously voted his admission into our body. We all looked forward with some impatience to the occasion which would enrol him among us. But I am greatly mistaken if Jack Redburn and myself were not by many degrees the most impatient of the party. At length the night came, and a few minutes after 10 Mr. Pickwick's knock was heard at the street door. He was shown into a lower room, and I directly took my crooked stick and went to accompany him upstairs, in order that he might be presented with all honour and formality. "Mr. Pickwick," said I, on entering the room, "I am rejoiced to see you, rejoiced to believe that this is but the opening of a long series of visits to this house, and but the beginning of a close and lasting friendship." The gentleman made a suitable reply, with a cordiality and frankness peculiarly his own, and glanced with a smile towards two persons behind the door whom I had not at first observed, and whom I immediately recognised as Mr. Samuel Weller and his father. It was a warm evening, but the elder Mr. Weller was attired, notwithstanding, in a most capricious greatcoat, and his chin enveloped in a large speckled shawl, such as is usually worn by stage coachmen on active service. He looked very rosy and very stout, especially about the legs, which appeared to have been compressed into his top boots with some difficulty. His broad brimmed hat he held under his left arm, and with the forefinger of his right hand he touched his forehead a great many times in acknowledgment of my presence. "I am very glad to see you in such good health, Mr. Weller," said I. "I thankee, sir," returned Mr. Weller. "The axle ain't broke yet. We keeps up a steady pace, not too severe, but with a moderate degree of friction, and the consekens is that ve're still a runnin' and comes in to the time reg'lar. My son Samivel, sir, as you may have read on in history," added Mr. Weller, introducing his firstborn. I received Sam very graciously, but before he could say a word his father struck in again. "Samivel Veller, sir," said the old gentleman, "has conferred upon me the ancient title of grandfather, vich had been long laid dormouse, and was supposed to be nearly hextinct in our family. Sammy, relate an anecdote of one o' them boys, that 'ere little anecdote about young Tony's sayin' as he would smoke a pipe unbeknown to his mother." "Be quiet, can't you?" said Sam. "I never see such a old magpie, never." "That 'ere Tony's the blessedest boy," said Mr. Weller, heedless of this rebuff, "the blessedest boy as I ever see in my days. Of all the charmin'est infants as ever I heard tell on, includin' them as was kivered over by the robin redbreasts arter they committed suicide with blackberries, there never was any like that 'ere little Tony. He's always a playin' with a quart pot, that boy is. To see him a settin' down on the doorstep pretendin' to drink out of it, and fetchin' a long breath artervards, and smokin' a bit o' firevood, and sayin', 'Now I'm grandfather.' To see him a doin' that at 2 year old is better than any play as was ever wrote. 'Now I'm grandfather.' He wouldn't take a pint pot if you was to make him a present on it, but he gets his quart, and then he says, 'Now I'm grandfather.'" Mr. Weller was so overpowered by this picture that he straightway fell into a most alarming fit of coughing, which must certainly have attended with some fatal result, but for the dexterity and promptitude of Sam, who, taking a firm grasp of the shawl just under his father's chin, shook him to and fro with great violence, at the same time administering some short blows between his shoulders. By this curious mode of treatment Mr. Weller was finally recovered, but with a very crimson face and in a state of great exhaustion. "He'll do now, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, who had been in some alarm himself. "He'll do, sir!" cried Sam, looking reproachfully at his parent. "Yes, he will do, one o' these days. He'll do for hisself, and then he'll wish he hadn't. Didn't anybody ever see such an inconsiderate old file? Laughing into conwulsions afore company, and stamping on the floor as if he'd brought his own carpet vith him, and was under a wager to punch the pattern out in a given time. He'll begin again in a minute. There! He's a going off. I said he would." In fact, Mr. Weller, whose mind was still running upon his precocious grandson, was seen to shake his head from side to side, while a laugh, working like an earthquake below the surface, produced various extraordinary appearances in his face, chest, and shoulders, the more alarming because unaccompanied by any noise whatever. These emotions, however, gradually subsided, and after 3 or 4 short relapses he wiped his eyes with the cuff of his coat, and looked about him with tolerable composure. "Afore the governor vithdraws," said Mr. Weller, "there is a pint respectin' vich Sammy has a question to ask. Vile that question is a pervadin' this here conwersation, p'raps the gen'l'man will permit me to retire." "Wot are you goin' away for?" demanded Sam, seizing his father by the coat tail. 'I never see such an undootiful boy as you, Samivel,' returned Mr. Weller. 'Didn't you make a solemn promise, amountin' almost to his speeches a while, that you'd put that 'ere question on my account?' 'Well, I'm agreeable to it,' said Sam, 'but not if you go cuttin' away like that,' as the bull turned round and mildly observed to the drover when they was a goadin' him into the butcher's door. 'The fact is, sir,' said Sam, addressing me, 'that he wants to know somethin' respectin' that 'ere lady as is housekeeper here.' 'Ay, what is that?' 'Why, sir,' said Sam, grinning still more, 'he wishes to know vether she—' 'In short,' interposed old Mr. Weller decisively, a perspiration breaking out upon his forehead, 'vether that 'ere old creetur is or is not a widder.' Mr. Pickwick laughed heartily, and so did I, as I replied decisively that my housekeeper was a spinster. 'There!' cried Sam. 'Now you're satisfied. You hear she's a spinster.' 'A wot?' said his father, with deep scorn. 'A spinster,' replied Sam. Mr. Weller looked very hard at his son for a minute or two, and then said, 'Never mind vether she makes jokes or not, that's no matter. Wot I say is that 'ere female a widder, or is she not?' 'What do you mean by her making jokes?' demanded Sam, quite aghast at the obscurity of his parent's speech. 'Never you mind, Samivel,' returned Mr. Weller gravely. 'Puns may be wery good things, or they may be wery bad ones, and a female may be none the better or she may be none the vurse for making of 'em. That's got nothin' to do with widders.' 'Why now,' said Sam, looking round, 'would anybody believe as a man of his time o' life could be running his head against spinsters and punsters being the same thing?' 'There ain't a straw's difference between 'em,' said Mr. Weller. 'Your father didn't drive a coach for so many years not to be equal to his own langvidge as far as that goes, Sammy.' Avoiding the question of etymology, upon which the old gentleman's mind was quite made up, he was several times assured that the housekeeper had never been married. He expressed great satisfaction on hearing this, and apologised for the question, remarking that he had been greatly terrified by a widow not long before, and that his natural timidity was increased in consequence. 'It was on the rail,' said Mr. Weller, with strong emphasis. 'I was a goin' down to Birmingham by the rail, and I was locked up in close carriage vith a living widder. Alone we was, the widder and me was alone, and I believe it was only because we was alone and there was no clergyman in the conweyance, that that 'ere widder didn't marry me afore we reached the half way station. Ven I think how she began a screamin' as we was goin' under them tunnels in the dark, how she kept on a faintin' and catchin' hold o' me, and how I tried to bust open the door as was tight locked and perwented all escape, it was an awful thing, most awful.' Mr. Weller was so very much overcome by this retrospect that he was unable, until he had wiped his brow several times, to return any reply to the question whether he approved of railway communication, notwithstanding that it would appear from the answer which he ultimately gave, that he entertained strong opinions on the subject. 'I consider,' said Mr. Weller, 'that the rail is unconstitootional and an inwaser o' priwileges, and I should wery much like to know wot that 'ere old Carter as once stood up for our liberties and won 'em too, I should like to know wot he vould say if he was alive now, to Englishmen being locked up with vidders or with anybody against their wills. What an old Carter would have said that an old coachman may say (and I assert that in that point of view alone the rail is an inwaser), as to the comfort, vere's the comfort o' sittin' in a harm chair looking at brick walls or heaps o' mud, never comin' to a public house, never seein' a glass o' ale, never goin' through a pike, never meetin' a change o' no kind, horses or othervise, but alvays comin' to a place ven you come to one at all, the wery pictur o' the last, with the wery same p'licemen standin' about, the same blessed old bell a ringin', the same unfortunate people standin' behind the bars a waitin' to be let in, and everythin' the same except the name, vich is wrote up in the same sized letters as the last name and vith the same colours, as to the honour and dignity o' travellin', vere can that be vithout a coachman, and wot's the rail to such coachmen and guards as is sometimes forced to go by it by an outrage and an insult? As to the pace, what sort o' pace d'ye think I, Tony Veller, could have kept a coach goin' at, for £500,000 a mile paid in adwance, after the coach was on the road? And as to the engine, a nasty wheezing, creaking, gasping, puffing, busting monster, always out of breath, with a shiny green and gold back, like an unpleasant beetle in that 'ere gas magnifier, as to the engine, it is always a pouring out red hot coals at night and black smoke in the day, the sensiblest thing it does, in my opinion, is ven there's something in the vay, and it sets up that 'ere frightful scream which seems to say, "Now here's 240 passengers in the wery greatest extremity o' danger, and here's their 240 screams in vun." By this time I began to fear that my friends would be rendered impatient by my protracted absence. I therefore begged Mr. Pickwick to accompany me upstairs, and left the two Mr. Wellers in the care of the housekeeper, laying strict injunctions upon her to treat them with all possible hospitality. Section 6